My name is Alexis Hargrove, and on New Year's Eve, my sister tried to corner me at the dinner table and take my grandmother's beach house from me. That place in Monterey is the only piece of my grandmother I have left. To my family, it is just something valuable they think they are owed, and that night, the family dinner was really about prying it out of my hands. My sister waited until everyone had a full plate before she spoke. She leaned closer, kept a polite smile, and told me I should sign everything over because, in her words, I did not need a place like that when I did not have children to bring there. The room went quiet in that heavy way when people are listening but pretending not to. My dad's jaw was already tight, like my answer had disappointed him long before I spoke. In that second, I understood this was not a question. It was an expectation, and I was supposed to nod and make it easy. I did not. I said no. My sister's smile vanished. Her wine glass hit the floor and shattered, red spreading across the hardwood. My dad shoved his chair back so hard it scraped, pointed at me, and called me selfish in front of everyone. I did not raise my voice. I stood up, took out my phone, and called my lawyer. When he answered, I walked toward the front door and used the one sentence I had rehearsed for days. Proceed with the plan. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. That kind of explosion never happens out of nowhere. A few weeks before that New Year's dinner, the first crack showed up in a group text my family uses to plan holidays. My older sister, Jordan Hargrove, dropped a casual message about making the most of Grandma's place in Monterey, then followed it with a paragraph about taxes, repairs, and how it would just be simpler if one person handled everything. She did not say my name, but everyone in that thread knew the deed had my signature on it. I stared at the screen before I answered. Growing up, Jordan was always the one who took up most of the space in a room. Our father, Mark, liked that about her. When she wanted something, she pushed until the people around her gave in, and he treated that as a virtue, not a warning sign. I understood early that keeping the peace usually meant letting her win. So I wrote back something neutral about being willing to discuss repairs and costs. Within minutes, my mother, Linda, replied with heart emojis and a line about how it's so good to see you girls working together. Jordan followed with a new message about how she had been running numbers and how much more efficient it would be if the house were placed under her name for convenience. That was the first time she put it in writing. She framed it as responsibility, as if she were volunteering for a hard job nobody else wanted. She mentioned her kids, their college funds, hinted that it would benefit the family as a whole if she could use the house as leverage for a better mortgage rate. Reading it, I could feel the familiar pattern settling over me, the one where my feelings came last by default. I did not argue in the chat. I said we should talk about it another time. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and tried to finish my coffee, but the message sat in my head like a stone. The house was not an abstract asset to me. I could still picture my grandmother at the tiny stove making pancakes while fog pressed against the windows. Losing the house would mean erasing the last place where I had ever felt fully chosen. Later that week, Jordan called me on the drive home from work. She did not ask if it was a good time. She launched straight into a monologue about rising property taxes, storms hitting the coast, and how irresponsible it was to keep such a valuable place just sitting there when I lived in a small apartment in the city. There was no pause in her voice where my opinion could fit. I listened, holding the phone away from my ear at points when her tone sharpened. She painted herself as practical, the one adult in the family willing to make tough choices. Every sentence carried the same message underneath. If I really cared about the family, I would step aside and let her take control. It sounded less like a suggestion and more like a verdict waiting for my signature. When she finally stopped to breathe, I told her I was not comfortable shifting the title to her. I kept my voice even and repeated that the house was my responsibility because Grandma had chosen me for that role. The silence on the line was heavier than any insult. Then she laughed once without humor and said she understood now why our dad always thought I was difficult. That word hung there for hours after we hung up. Difficult. Not loyal or protective. Just an obstacle in the way of whatever plan she had drawn up on a spreadsheet. I went to bed that night understanding that this was no longer a vague family disagreement. Jordan had decided the beach house belonged to the future she imagined for herself, and anything less than my full cooperation would be treated as an attack. In our family, money was something we pretended not to talk about while making every decision around it. When Grandma was alive, she was the one person who ignored that rule. She told me directly that the house would be mine, that she trusted me to keep it safe and not turn it into a bargaining chip. She never said Jordan's name in those conversations, and that omission felt deliberate even back then. The invitation to New Year's dinner arrived a few days after that phone call. The message in our group chat was cheerful and full of exclamation marks. But I could read the subtext clearly enough to know what it meant. Jordan wanted everyone at the same table, under the same roof, with the same script in her head about what I was supposed to do. By the time I tapped "I'll be there," I knew I was walking toward a confrontation, not a celebration. The week leading up to that dinner gave me no room to breathe. Jordan turned the pressure from background noise into a routine. She started with links about property maintenance and tax penalties, as if I had never paid a bill in my life. Each message came with a comment about how complicated things become when people do not plan ahead, and somehow the notifications always landed in the middle of my workday. At the firm, I could focus on other people's blueprints and schedules, but every time I opened my personal email, my attention snapped. One afternoon, my inbox held a new surprise, a scanned packet labeled draft documents that Jordan said her friend had put together to help us. Attached was a quitclaim deed with my full name on the line for the current owner, and hers typed neatly on the line below. The template made it look like a minor formality, as if the decision had already been made, and all that was missing was my signature. She called not long after. Her voice was bright and controlled, the tone she used when she wanted to sound like the reasonable one in the room. She talked about year-end advantages and efficiency, and how generous it was of her to offer to shoulder the responsibility. The way she framed it, signing away ownership was a favor she was doing for me, a way to simplify my life so I could stop worrying. I let her finish before I answered. The deed glowed on my computer screen while she spoke, my name flattened into a line on a form I had never asked anyone to create. When I told her I had no plans to sign anything, there was a brief, static pause on the line. Then she shifted back into the careful, professional tone and said she understood I was emotional and that we would revisit it soon. That evening, my parents invited me over for what my mother described as a quiet coffee before the holidays became chaotic. Their kitchen looked the same as it had when I was 17. My father sat at the table with his chipped mug, hands wrapped around it like he needed the warmth to stay calm. For the first few minutes, he stuck to memories. The drives to Monterey, my grandmother waving from the porch, my sister and me tracking sand into the hallway. The turn came gradually. He moved from stories to numbers, from nostalgia to the cost of repairs, insurance, and his own retirement. He said life did not leave much space for sentimental assets, that responsible adults learned to let go of things that did not pull their weight. My mother sat at the end of the table folding a paper napkin into smaller and smaller squares. When she spoke, it was only to say that she hated seeing her daughters strain their relationship over just a house. By the time my father mentioned the deed, it sounded to them like the answer to a problem they had already solved. He said Jordan had shown him the draft and praised her initiative. Then he asked calmly, when I planned to sign so everyone could move forward. There was no accusation in his voice yet, only expectation. Something in me locked into place when I heard the question. For years I had responded to that tone with explanations, compromises, softer versions of what I really thought. This time I chose a single, plain sentence. I told him I was not transferring the house. I did not decorate it with reasons or apologies. The words landed between us with a finality I felt in my chest. The refrigerator hummed in the silence that followed. My father's expression cooled, the warmth from the earlier stories gone. He reminded me that Jordan had a family to think about, that she and her husband were doing everything right and still struggling. He asked what I thought I was proving by hanging on to a place I visited a few weekends a year. There were explanations I could have given about the way my grandmother had pressed the spare key into my palm, or how the sound of waves outside that little Monterey house was the only thing that ever made my shoulders drop. Instead, I stayed with the same clear line. The house was mine because my grandmother chose me to keep it, and I was not interested in renegotiating that choice. When I stood to leave, my mother followed me to the door. She touched my arm lightly and asked me to think about whether holding on to that place was worth the damage I was causing. The question stayed with me on the drive home. By the time I reached my apartment and fit the key into my own lock, my hands were unsteady, but my decision about the house was not. The next day at work, I stopped pretending this would go away on its own. I sat through one morning meeting without hearing a word of it. My mind kept circling the image of my name on that deed, lined up above Jordan's like a before and after someone else had already scripted. By lunchtime, I had a headache and a dull anger that felt different from the usual guilt. I opened my browser and searched for a real estate attorney near my office instead of microwaving the leftovers I had brought from home. The receptionist who answered sounded unfazed when I explained that my family was pressuring me over a house. She put me on a brief hold, then came back and offered a consultation that same afternoon. I agreed before I could talk myself out of it. Walking over to that office felt like stepping across a line between letting things happen to me and choosing what happened next. The practice was in a narrow building between a coffee shop and a copy center. Inside, the waiting room was quiet and ordinary. When the attorney came out to greet me, he introduced himself as Daniel Foster and shook my hand like this was just another day of paperwork. For him, it probably was. For me, it felt like I was admitting out loud that my own family might try to move around the edges of the law. In his office, I laid everything out as plainly as I could. I told him about my grandmother leaving me the Monterey house, about the messages, about the draft deed with my name already typed in place. I set my phone on his desk and scrolled through the group chat and the emails so he could see I was not exaggerating. He read in silence, his expression tightening only slightly when he reached the parts where Jordan talked about convenience and leverage. When he finally looked up, his first question was simple. He asked whether there were any existing documents beyond the deed itself. I thought of my grandmother at her small kitchen table, sliding a manila folder toward me years earlier and telling me to keep it somewhere safe. I had tucked it into a drawer in my bedroom closet and almost never looked at it. That folder contained the trust she had set up, naming me as both trustee and primary beneficiary of the house. I told Daniel about the trust, and his attention sharpened. He asked me to bring in copies as soon as possible. The way he explained it, if the trust had been written the way I remembered, the house was not just casually in my name, the way my family kept saying. It was under a structure that gave me responsibility and rights, and that meant anyone trying to get me to sign it away might be stepping into trouble that was bigger than a family argument. He did not tell me to cut off my family. He did not tell me what to feel about them. He laid out options in language I could follow. We could record updated paperwork with the county to confirm the trust's control. We could prepare a formal letter from his office to my sister and my parents, explaining that any further attempts to pressure me into signing documents could be viewed as coercive, We could tighten how access to the house was handled, so there were clear boundaries about who was allowed to use it and when. Listening, I felt some of the helplessness drain away. The situation began to sound like something that existed on paper, not just in the space between my ribs. There were forms and filings and certified letters that could stand between my grandmother's house and my sister's plans. The conflict was still painful, but it no longer felt like a storm I had to face with bare hands. By the time we finished, a plan had taken shape. I would bring him the trust documents the next morning. He would review them, file what needed to be filed, and draft a letter outlining my position. I would decide how and when to deliver that message to my family, and under what circumstances I wanted him to step in directly. He asked me to think carefully about what I was willing to tolerate and what I was not, and to write that down for myself before our next meeting. I left his office as the afternoon light slid between the buildings. The problem with my family had not disappeared. They still believed they were entitled to the Monterey house, and I knew they would not drop the topic just because a stranger in a suit disagreed with them. But I no longer felt like the only barrier between their wishes and the life my grandmother had intended for me. There was a path on paper now, and my name was on it by choice. New Year's Eve did not feel festive when I pulled onto my parents' street in Monterey. The tote bag on the passenger seat held the trust papers and Daniel's card under a folded sweater. I was not planning to wave legal documents around over dinner, but I wanted a physical reminder that my grandmother's choice lived somewhere other than in my memory. My parents had insisted that the holiday meal happen at their house, not at the beach place. It was easier for them. Their dining room had always been the stage for conversations that looked calm and left bruises you could not point to. When I stepped inside, the television was tuned to a muted countdown show. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken, and every voice carried a thin edge of nerves. Jordan stood beside my mother at the counter, arranging serving dishes in a precise row. Her husband, Ethan Blake, leaned against the opposite counter with his phone in one hand, offering a brief nod in place of a greeting. My mother gave me a quick hug, then went back to stirring gravy. My father wiped his hands on a dish towel and said he was glad I made it down. No one mentioned the house as we moved through small questions about traffic and work. We sat as soon as the last pan hit the table. Conversations skimmed over safe ground at first. School projects, gas prices, a neighbor's new dog. I answered when someone spoke directly to me and watched my father instead of my plate, noticing how his attention kept sliding back in my direction whenever the topic drifted close to money or plans. Jordan eased into it as if she were still making small talk. She asked whether my firm was keeping me in the city most nights, whether I ever had time to get down to the Coast House anymore. The Monterey place sounded, in her mouth, like an unused membership at a club. I said my schedule was manageable and let the answer sit. She shifted to storms on the news and insurance claims in seaside towns, tracing the outline of an argument she had already decided to make. The turn was a single gesture. Jordan set her fork down, folded her napkin into a tight rectangle, and turned her chair toward me. She said she had been thinking seriously about the future, about stability for her kids, about how rare it was for a young family to have access to real property. She started calling the Monterey place the asset, a word that scraped against everything I knew about that house. To her, it was leverage. To me, it was my grandmother's handwriting on a folder and the smell of coffee in a tiny kitchen. My father listened with the quiet focus he usually reserved for financial news. Jordan talked about refinancing, about using equity from the house to secure a better mortgage, about the college tuition bills that would eventually land in their mailbox. Every sentence circled the same center. In her view, my holding on to full ownership made no sense when I had no spouse, no children, and a rented apartment an hour away. The urge to smooth things over rose so fast it almost beat my heartbeat. I could hear the easy lines forming in my head, the ones that promised we could look at options later or talk about it another time. Those phrases had kept peace for years and cost me more than I liked to admit. Sitting there between my parents and my sister, I realized that using them again would mean agreeing that my place in this family depended on how much I was willing to surrender. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded calmer than I felt. I said I understood that she cared about her children and their future, that I knew the house came with bills and repairs. Then I told them I was not transferring ownership of the Monterey house to anyone. I did not dress it up with apologies or promises. I placed the decision where it belonged and left it there. The reaction was quiet but heavy. My father set his glass down harder than he needed to and asked if I had really thought through what I was denying the family. He talked about opportunity and sacrifice, about how families were supposed to help each other when one person was in a position to carry more of the weight. My mother whispered that she hated tension on a night that was supposed to be hopeful. Ethan looked down at his plate and stayed silent. Jordan's expression emptied of warmth as she watched me, calculating what my answer meant for the plan she had been building in her head. Under my chair, the edge of the tote bag nudged my ankle, a small, solid reminder that I was not walking into this fight unarmed. The silence after my answer did not last. My father's hand tightened around his glass. Across the table, Jordan's jaw locked into the expression I recognized from arguments she had already decided to win. She folded her napkin once, set it down, and turned toward me. She said she was trying to help everyone, that she wanted fairness, that it made no sense for a single sister with no children to hold on to a property the rest of the family could use. The word children carried more judgment than concern. No one said anything. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed even. I said the house was not something I intended to give away or rearrange. I did not offer a compromise. I left the boundary plain. Jordan's control snapped. She grabbed her wine glass with a quick, impatient movement. It clipped her plate and slipped from her hand. The crash of glass against hardwood cut through the room, followed by the spread of red across the floor. My mother jumped up, reaching for towels that were nowhere near enough. The spill gave my father a target. He shoved his chair back and stood so quickly the table shook. When he spoke, his voice was low and hard. He called me selfish. He said I was making Jordan's life harder out of spite. He dragged my grandmother into it, insisting she would be disappointed to see me risk the family's stability over one house. That tone used to knock the air out of me. Standing there with glass glittering under the table, I understood that no amount of giving in had ever earned me what I actually wanted from them. The house was not the problem. My refusal was. I set my napkin beside my plate and stood. No one asked where I was going. I walked to the front door, pulled my phone from my pocket, and stepped onto the small porch, where the night air smelled faintly of salt. Daniel answered on the second ring. The steadiness in his voice cut through the noise in my head. I did not describe the broken glass or repeat my father's words. We had already talked through what this night might look like if my family kept pushing. I reminded him of the trust documents and the draft letter, then said the sentence we had chosen as our signal. Proceed with the plan. He did not hesitate. He said he would send the finalized notice to my sister and my parents right away, copying me on every message. He would move ahead with recording the additional paperwork confirming the trust's control of the Monterey house and my role as trustee. Calmly, he added that from this point on, attempts to pressure me into signing away my interest could be viewed not only as conflict, but as conduct with potential legal consequences. When I went back inside, the table looked frozen mid-disaster. My father crouched with a dish towel, gathering glass into a small pile. My mother blotted at the stain on the floor. Jordan sat upright, arms folded, eyes bright with anger she could not place anywhere useful. No one asked whom I had called. About 15 minutes after I told Daniel to move ahead, my phone buzzed on the sideboard. A moment later, my father's and Ethan's phones lit up where they rested beside their plates. The subject line on the new email carried my grandmother's full name and the words, "Trust clarification." I watched my father read. The color left his face as he scrolled. Jordan reached for the phone, and he handed it to her without speaking. Her eyes moved quickly over the lines that laid out, in neutral language, exactly what the trust allowed and what it did not. The message stated that I, as trustee and primary beneficiary, had no obligation to transfer or dilute my interest, and that any documents presented to me outside proper legal counsel should be treated with caution. The only sounds in the room were the quiet scrape of my mother's paper towel against the floor and the faint television in the living room. No one looked at me while they read. With each sentence, the balance in the room shifted. For once, the fact that my grandmother had trusted me with that house more than anyone else was not just a memory. It was written down in a form that did not care who had raised their voice first. When my father finally set the phone down, the speech I had been bracing for did not come. Jordan's knuckles were pale around the device she still held. Ethan stared at the window. The argument they had arrived prepared to make could not move past the new line that had just appeared between us. The house they treated as a bargaining chip was now surrounded by boundaries they could not cross, without risking something heavier than my disapproval. The rest of that night felt stiff. My father sat back down and said we should finish dinner. No one reached for the food. My mother swept broken glass into a mixing bowl. Jordan stared at the email on her phone, scrolling as if a different result might appear. I sat because standing in the doorway felt like begging for understanding I was not going to get. Conversation shrank to comments about television while the countdown show flashed in the living room, and the four of us stayed quiet around a table that suddenly felt too small. When the plates had been pushed to the edges, I began stacking them. My mother joined me. In the kitchen, under the sound of running water, she said she hated watching her daughters fight and wished I had been more flexible. To her, the damage started and ended with my refusal. I rinsed a plate and knew there was no version of this where saying yes would have earned me anything but a new demand later. I left before dessert. No speech, no slammed door. I picked up my tote bag, thanked my parents for the meal, and walked out into the cold Monterey air. No one followed me. The quiet in the driveway felt like the first breath after leaving a crowded room. On the drive home, my phone lit up with 2 messages from Jordan. One accused me of betraying the family. The other predicted I would regret choosing lawyers over family. I read them once in the parking lot outside my building and archived them. Over the next week, Daniel sent confirmation that the new filings had been recorded and that his office had formally notified my parents and Jordan of my position. The document simply affirmed that the Monterey house remained in the trust my grandmother created, with me as trustee and primary beneficiary, and that any attempt to pressure or mislead me into signing it away could carry consequences beyond holiday tension. My parents called together once. I let it go to voicemail. My father sounded tired as he said they did not understand why I had escalated things instead of resolving them within the family. My mother's voice came at the end, asking me to call back when I was ready to be reasonable. I listened and heard only a request to step back into the role I had just refused. In the end, I replied with a short message. I wrote that I would not be discussing the beach house directly with them or with Jordan anymore, and that any questions about access or logistics should go through Daniel. I thanked them for the holidays we had shared in Monterey when Grandma was alive, and did not offer anything about future visits. They never answered. The next holiday passed without an invitation. The first time I drove back to the house alone after everything, low fog hung over the water. Inside, the chipped mugs waited in their cabinet. The place looked smaller than the version I carried in my head, but it also felt more honest. It was no longer a prize in someone else's plan. It was a responsibility I had finally accepted on my own terms. I walked through each room, checking locks and gathering the few things my parents had left so I could mail them back. The silence there did not feel like punishment. It felt like space. Room to decide who I wanted to be inside this house without a chorus of opinions attached to every decision. Standing by the front window with a mug of coffee in my hands, I thought about how often people say that family is everything, as if that sentence alone excuses any demand. What almost never gets said is how often family becomes a lever to move other people's boundaries. If any part of this sounds familiar, I hope it reminds you that holding a line someone else wants you to cross does not make you cruel. Protecting what you were trusted with, whether that is a house, a savings account, or simply your own peace, is not selfishness. It is loyalty to the person who believed in you and to the version of yourself who finally decided that keeping the room quiet was not worth disappearing. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you for listening to my story. If you feel like it, tell me where you are watching from.